Hello, everyone. Gary here from Timeline Astrology. This is the January 2025 Sidereal forecast. A very happy new year to everybody. Before we get into the transits for January, I am doing a separate year-long forecast. That's January 5th for a 2-hour presentation going month by month and looking at the main themes of the year. You can sign up for the live show or you can get the playback. January, just like any January, is all about new beginnings, isn't it? But this year, as much as we might have a new beginning on the calendar, it doesn't feel like a gung-ho, like just make your New Year's resolutions and power through and get everything done. It's just not that, unfortunately. Now, you can pretend it is and try and do all you can to push through whatever it is you're trying to push through. But with a Mars retrograde in Cancer, going back signs from Cancer to Gemini, and currently in January opposite Pluto, that ain't going to happen, I don't think. And if it does happen, it's with a lot of will on your part, a lot of mustering all your willpower to try and force something through that is premature. And in that case, you have to question whether it's worth putting all that extra energy, exhausting yourself in the process of getting this thing or trying to, because you're not going to get this thing past the finish line just yet. Mars is going retrograde, so it won't go forward until the end of February. Now, if you can factor that in and use this energy of Mars retrograde opposite Pluto to dig deep within yourself and to do the inner work that this suggests, then you're more likely on a winner. If you otherwise put all your attention on outward things and trying to force things forward, whatever Mars maybe specifically represents for you and the sign Cancer and the sign Gemini, which it goes back to by the end of January, these places in your life are not likely to move forward and certainly not smoothly. In another way, of course, planets don't actually move backwards, even though they do, from our perspective, move back through signs. The planet isn't moving backwards. It is still moving forward in space, but we sense that it is. And if we don't pay attention to that, we are going to beat ourselves up trying to get something moving forward when it's just not its time. It's time to redo things. It's time to reassess things. And with this Mars opposite Pluto, I believe it's time to look at our deeper motivations more than that anything, because we have this kind of Mars externalized desire and willfulness to do something, but then we have this Pluto deeper desire that might be pitted against that. And so you have to question, why, oh why do I keep making these resolutions every year and then they just fall flat by the end of the month of January? For most people, let's face it, unless you're very Mars-like and you're really good at like pushing something through, like, and making your vision boards and making something happen, and just with sheer willfulness alone, just your power of intent can make something happen. That's not everybody. And even those people right now with Mars retrograde are just not going to be able to power through that like they would normally. So it's best to look at what are the deeper motivations with Pluto opposite Mars, and instead of looking at as a hindrance or a block to what you want to get, perhaps it might be a better time to think about what are my deeper motivations? What is kind of working against my more conscious desires, as it were? So that's Mars opposite Pluto. Venus and Saturn come together in Aquarius, and we can think about Aquarius as our long-term goals. And Saturn is almost finished in Aquarius. It will finish by the end of March. So it's got 3 more months moving through Aquarius. And Saturn in any sign, by the end of the sign, it's usually brought to bear whatever it is that it was going to bring. It doesn't do so from the beginning of a transit necessarily, but Saturn, as is its nature, slowly grinds away and slowly chips away. And then finally, at the end of the day, you get this sense of, okay, this is what this is now. I can't avoid this issue. This is what's happening in this area of my life, whatever the area Aquarius is for you. Now that Venus is coming together with Saturn, it's a bit of a downer in one way. It's more sobering, after all of the festivities of the, new year. Everything settles down into Saturn signs. The sun also moves into Capricorn mid-month, and Venus and Saturn come together by the end of January. by degree. So it just feels like a bit more sobering and realistic and, just having to take that kind of big step back and look at our big plans for the year ahead. Again, together with Mars, which is so frustrated in Cancer, aspecting Saturn and now also Venus, we might be very frustrated unless we do take that step back and reappraise our long-term objectives here. Mercury shifts signs, which is more positive for sure because it's moving out of Scorpio and all of that sort of worst case scenario thinking. And, it's almost like coming out of this disenchanted forest in a way. It's not even an enchanted forest in Scorpio these days because Saturn is looking on. Now that Mercury's coming out of that, it's coming out of this disenchantment in a way and opening up its vista into Sagittarius. So it feels more open, at least in terms of what we're planning. But planning is one thing with Mercury, doing is another thing with Mars, remember. So, yeah, maybe make your plans and maybe think more hopefully and optimistically and more expansively in terms of your plans, but consider the steps that you're going to have to take and be especially patient in how you're going to get there. And then finally, the other thing I'm going to talk about is Venus, which makes its way all the way to Pisces by the end of the month of January and will stay in Pisces for the following 4 months. So it's a prolonged Venus exaltation this year, which is very positive. It's also very complicated because of its conjunctions with Rahu, the North Node, with Neptune, and all the other planets gathering in Pisces by March. And then it's retrograde in March, April. So it's definitely complicated, but it's also something to treasure and appreciate with Venus exalted, which also exchanges with Jupiter, which is still in Taurus. And so this Venus Jupiter exchange is another part at the end of January that will be a major silver lining in the year ahead, in a year that is quite volatile, quite a tumultuous year, quite a stormy time. And these are the main silver linings, I would say. Venus exalted and exchanging with Jupiter in Taurus. So Venus in Aquarius before any of that, though, is again conjunct Saturn. So we're just going to have to think about what are our intentions for this new year. And we'll have to be a bit more sober in terms of our finances and in terms of our relationships. And yet at the same time, it's in Aquarius, Venus in Aquarius with Saturn. And Aquarius is also about pushing boundaries and trying out new things and experimenting. It's just that with its conjunction with Saturn, we're probably going to have to be a bit more, um, I would say, a bit more cautious in any experimentation that we do, whether it's with our relationships or whoever that is, whatever relationship Venus represents for you, or again with our money, we have to just be a bit more cautious, even though it's also about experimenting somewhat. As I mentioned, the Mars opposite Pluto, its exact opposition is January 3rd. So we're right into it. And the moon is conjoined Pluto from the very beginning. So there's a trigger here. Now, it might not be an obvious trigger, as in external events in your own life. But for me, the image that I have thought about for this is kind of like sitting on top of a volcano and trying to keep a lid on it. That's what this feels like to me. It's kind of like Mars is retrograde in Cancer, so it's really biting its lip and not expressing something it feels it wants to express, but doesn't know how to express, perhaps. And then Pluto's opposite in Capricorn, and that is itself quite detached. And so these coming opposite each other now is this kind of, again, putting a lid on it. Now, that doesn't mean you should. I'm not saying that you should sit on it and not express it, but that perhaps you could find ways to, healthy ways, ideally, to vent, to dig deep and find the emotional resolve. And there's that word resolve, isn't it? Again, even though I don't like New Year's resolutions, maybe the only resolution here would be to resolve. It's like, maybe not making lists as such, but just resolving to whatever, to align with what is happening in whatever way it's happening, in whatever way it's not happening, right? Let me resolve this in me. Nothing's happening in this situation. I can't seem to get ahead in this situation or whatever, in this event in my life. this relationship, this whatever. So let me see if I can just have some resolution around that. Maybe it's telling me to go and look within myself, to slow down and pay attention. So be mindful, of course, of triggers. There are lots of triggers with this conjunction or this opposition of Mars and Pluto. Mars is retrograde until the end of February. So in January, it continues in Cancer. And then by the end of January, January 21st, it moves back into Gemini and completes its retrograde there in February. And in a way, well, it's not that one is better than the other. And I guess we should stay away from good or bad in some instances. But certainly in Cancer, it's challenging because Mars feels a lot but doesn't know how to express it necessarily. And it might feel a bit debilitating for certain folk. But in Gemini, it thinks a lot about things, and Mars doesn't like to just think. Mars likes to take action, and it's having to rethink. It's not just having to think, it's having to rethink things and go back over things it's forgotten in Gemini because it already made it out of Gemini and now it's going back in by the end of the month. So it starts off with a lot of emotional intensity in Cancer, and then it finishes with a lot of sort of mental frustration, I would say, in Gemini and into February. So just be mindful and take heed, I would say. Again, I mentioned Mercury is going into Sagittarius, so this is one of the more positive transits of the month for sure. Everything is starting to open out because Mercury was in Scorpio for so long because of its retrograde, and so there was a lot of like dwelling and getting stuck on quite negative things. And for very good reason, you might say, considering what's going on in the world. But this is a time now to think big, and or a bigger at least, and to open up your vista to be able to see things from a different vantage point. Just that sense of coming out of a dark forest and things opening up ahead and brightening up. That's enough to kind of lift the mood, essentially. So I do think this one will lift the mood. Then the full moon, which is in Gemini, opposite Mercury in Sagittarius. It's in Gemini and this lunar mansion called Purnarvasu, which bridges both Gemini and Cancer. Full moon is on January 13th. This is where it's about connecting the head and the heart. And as one of my mentors, Kishori, refers to, the mind rooted in the heart field. So essentially, that's what this lunar mansion is all about. The image of this Purnarvasu, return of the light, is essentially what it means, is a bow and arrow, and the arrow being returned to the quiver. And all of that symbolism of bow and arrows and aiming your arrow and aiming at the target and being at one with the target to achieve whatever it is, to get clear and to get to the point and to get to the truth as well. It's a big theme of this lunar mansion. It's a mind that is rooted in the heart that will get to the truth, not a mind that's disconnected. And there is a word for this in Vedic philosophy. It's called chitta. It's like the heart mind. It's like a combination of the heart and the mind, as opposed to this sense of them being separate, like my head and heart. Like my head is saying one thing and my heart is saying something else. You know how people say this? Well, in this case, it's more that they are one, and that this notion of putting our hand on our heart and really allowing the mind to, again, root, as Kishori says, root in the heart, is likely to bring more clarity than if it were this sense of disconnect. And that's why this time, this full moon in Gemini on January 13th is a good time to start out the new year, to hand on heart, really focus on what is true for you, of course. The sun is about to move, and this is another interesting thing that's happening for the coming months now. For the next few months, we have every full moon at the very last degree of a sign. So that means that as soon as we have the full moon, the culmination point, then we have the sun move signs, either later that day or the next day. So the next day, then we have the sun move into Sidereal Capricorn, January 14th. And this shifts the mood because it takes it from all of that kind of big ideas, big ideals in Sagittarius and applies them in Capricorn. So it's a bit more, again, sobering and more practical and pragmatic. And let's just get on with this, whatever we have set our intentions on, that we have to knuckle down and do it. There's no avoiding what we have to do to get to where we need to go. And the fact that Sun is joining Pluto and it's opposite Mars It means that it's the midpoint of the Mars retrograde. And so this is very much a time to, again, look within and have that resolve, in a sense, to look within and to figure out what is it that we truly want, as opposed to kind of just repeating the same mantra that we have over and over to ourselves that this is what I want consciously. When if something else keeps showing up in other ways that either go against that or are just completely different to that, it's worth looking at that. What is that? Why do I keep experiencing this when I keep having this desire for this other thing? It just doesn't happen. So this is a great time to really shine a light on what that is. So then Venus by the end of the month, before we get to the new moon at the very end of the month, we have Venus move into Pisces on January 28th. And so this brings a shift and a very subtle shift, perhaps initially, but we have to be mindful of, that image I was thinking of sitting on top of a volcano and keeping a lid on it, and whether we should do that or not. But imagine yourself sitting on top of a volcano, and then you have these rose tinted glasses on. It's like you're just completely, trying to ignore the fact that you're sitting on top of a volcano and then you're looking around with rose-tinted glasses and imagining, all of the wonderful things that are going on. And there likely are wonderful things with Venus in Pisces, but Venus and Rahu and Neptune in Pisces is like almost hoodwinking ourselves or being hoodwinked by someone else, being fooled and or fooling ourselves. And I'm not saying you shouldn't, like fake it till you make it kind of thing, that you have to, in a way, wear the rose tinted glasses to be able to see things differently. But is it going to be a good idea to, not deal with what you need to deal with, that thing that's bubbling underneath, while you're just looking around at things, just fantasizing about your life in some way that is just not real? I mean, you could be completely deluded and not do anything with these transits, which do suggest when you do something with them, you could make some amazing things happen. When you're just aware of what is possible and not fantastical, you can absolutely make some major leaps forward here and create some major developments in your life, like major creative things. Just thinking creatively about your life in ways that you haven't before, as opposed to again tuning out to what's happening and ignoring that kind of volcano underneath you, that surge of energy underneath you that wants to come up and out, but doesn't have a direct way of coming out. And, instead using that as fuel for this kind of new inspired life that you could create for yourself. I don't want to sound too hokey cokey about it, but this does look like an astrology that is potentially life altering, and in a very positive way. And it's only going to be negative if we're trying to ignore reality and fantasize or trip out in some way so that we're not dealing with what is. But if we deal with what is, we're more likely to make our dreams a reality as opposed to this fantasy world that we could easily escape into right now. So finally, then the new moon is in Capricorn. And so obviously, this is more realistically the new start to the year. Okay, we've had the whole new moon in Sagittarius from the end of December. So that was setting our intentions and our aspirations and our inspirations and all of those things. Wonderful sounding words. Now we're getting to Capricorn, where it's about a realistic appraisal of what is possible. And some things might not be. And like and most people know, by the end of January, most people drop their New Year's resolutions by the end of January. And so this is a time with this new moon in Capricorn to consider what is it that's left once everything is dropped. Everything has fallen away, and you're just left with this thing to focus on. And maybe that's a good thing because you didn't have all of these other things distracting you, and this is what you need to focus on. And so this new moon in Capricorn might focus you on that more. It's in the lunar mansion called Shravana, and Shravana means listening. It's hearing. One of the symbols literally an ear, and another is three footsteps. So it's all about following and listening, and it has a connection with, in the Vedic pantheon of gods, this sense of, and this is ruled by Vishnu, and it's very much about listening And you might know that image of Vishnu lying and listening to the conch shell. It's very much about tuning into ourselves and listening and to what's true. But, we sometimes also need to listen to others and get good advice from others in order for us to be clear about where to go. What path should we be taking? But it's more important, I think, to listen, to tune into our own inner guidance in a sense, to really slow down and be still with this new moon, as every new moon is a time to be still. And this one, again, to just quiet everything down so that you can hear what you need to hear and feel the calling to wherever you need to go. That's the new moon on the 29th of January. One last thing before I leave it. Uranus is about to station direct at the very end of the month on January 31st. It had returned to Aries in December, but now it's stationing and it's its last station in Aries for like 80 years or so. And it's going to make it out of Aries by March. So there's some turnaround going on here in terms of Uranus and Aries, and therefore likely in terms of what's going on in all the wars around the world. Because since Uranus moved into Aries in 2016, it has initiated a lot of wars. And, you know, this is likely to shift something in that respect in the geopolitical landscape. I don't know what that might be, but even just in terms of thinking about it for ourselves, like how we initiate something. With Uranus stationing direct, it's more initiatory. So again, this is pointing to the end of January being more about starting something with that new moon and now Uranus moving forward in Aries. So that is it for January. Just coming up in February, just to mention, Jupiter is about to station direct at the beginning of February. So that's going to start moving forward as well. And then Mars is moving forward by the end of February. And then, therefore, by the end of the month in February, all of the planets are moving forward for a few days at least, because then into March, Venus goes retrograde. So we'll have to deal with that when March comes. A lot more complication going on in March for sure. It's probably the most complicated month of the whole year. But in February, we do have this sense of things moving forward. So I just want to mention a couple of things before I leave, and that is that I have my 2025 timelines presentation on January 5th. That's from 6 to 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. I'm going to take a look at all of these major transits in the year, breaking down each month, and those who attend will get a calendar for the year and basically a guide to the whole year. And then if you would like to pick up your sign, so I have recorded separate video presentations on each sign, an hour or sometimes even an hour and a half, depending on the sign, for the whole year. An overview of 2025 for each sidereal sign. So if you'd like to go to patreon.com/timeline astrology, you'll find your sign there. Or you can just go to timelineastrology.com and you'll find the links. And so that is it, folks. I wish you all the very best for not just the month of January, but for a new year. It is going to be an interesting year. Let me put it that way. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be earth-shattering. It's going to change a lot in so many ways for so many people. Like you might say everybody on the planet. And we're going to look at life pre and post 2025 in many ways, looking back. And that's not a bad thing, considering where things seem to be heading in our current climate. That's not a bad thing at all. Things are changing in a big way. And so, again, sign up for your yearly forecast on January 5th. You get the playback also, or for your sign, and learn how to work with these transits in the year for your sign. Again, go to patreon.com/timeline astrology or just timelineastrology.com. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and until next time.